Rozpoczną teraz swój wykład pani profesor Paula Borges Santos, reprezentująca Nowy Uniwersytet w Lizbonie, i pan profesor Luciano Arone da Abreu z Katolickiego Uniwersytetu Pontyfikalnego Rio Grande do Sul z Brazylii. Przedstawią nam temat dotyczący autorytarnego konstytucjonalizmu, przypadek Brazylii i Portugalii. It's your time. You have 20 minutes, please.
I would like to begin by thanking the organizers, in particular Professor Arkadiusz Adamski, for inviting us here. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to... And now? Okay. I repeat. I would like to begin to thanking the organizers, in particular Professor Arkadiusz Adamski, for inviting us here. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to strengthen ties with Polish Academy. Our presentation is about the authoritarian constitutions of Portugal and Brazil. The authoritarian regimes of Salazar and Vargas were defined by the adoption of new political constitutions which sought to refound the political existence of their respective states. These constitutions formed part of a broader institutional reforms initiated in both countries aimed at addressing the crisis of democracy identified by various sectors of their political communities since 1920s. In both cases, therefore, the primary rationale for enacting such constitutions was the deliberate rupture with the liberal status quo. In the Portuguese case, although any continuity was obscured, the 1933 constitution retained certain forms of the preceding liberal constitutionalism, even if they didn't embrace its substance. In Brazil, the rupture occurred directly against the supposedly liberal order established by the 1934 constitution, which, according to Vargas-era intellectuals, represented an oligarchic setback of the reforms initiated by the Revolution of 1930, of which the 1937 regimes claimed to be the continuation. In Brazilian case, however, even though some forms of liberal constitutionalism were also preserved, it is important to emphasize that the 1937 constitution was decreed by the President of the Republic himself, rather than promulgated by the representatives of the Brazilian people, as had been the case with its previous documents, 1934 and 1891, under the justification of national security against communist infiltration. In any case of both Portugal and Brazil, one can observe a dissociation between the liberal traits of their constitutional form and the authoritarian content of their respective charters, from which their important aspects emerge. 1. Political authorities considered it important to renounce the constitutional model. 2. Complementing the first point, the legitimacy provided by the Constitution was deemed necessary by the regimes. And 3. The constitutions themselves served as instruments to restrict democracy in each of these countries. Now, the case of Portugal. In Portugal, the discussion surrounding the constitutional solution was inherited from the final months of Republic's tenure. Indeed, in January 1926, the Congress of the Republic had resolved to advance by 5 years the revision of the 1911 Constitution, recognizing the need to reforms of the parliamentary system itself. while different parties, sectors are already advocating for the preservation of the bicameral system that would accommodate the representation of professional class interests. 15 days after the military coup, the constitutional question became part of the ministerial agenda, being announced as a governmental priority. The crisis of democracy institutions was denounced, caused by the poor functioning of the legislative power and the weakness and constant change of the executive power. It was argued that these powers can incapable of guiding, directing, and supervising national activities, and it was denounced that by having separate policies from the economy, these powers was alienate social forces from the constitution and the functioning of the stating, resulting in a dehumanization of the economy and the class struggle. The prevailing imperative was a complete dissociation from the Republican experience. Amidst so many debates and the lack of consensus regarding the direction of constitutional reform, the constituent process became quite lengthy, without following any of typified varieties of constitution assembly. It was a singular constitution process that did not pass through legislative chambers. The Constitution Act was initiated by the executive. A working group was formed, which consulted more representative personalities of the political forces supporting the dictatorship, and the constitutional proposal was submitted into political bodies: the National Political Council, which advisory powers of the special functions of evaluating the draft political constitution and the electoral and administrative codes, and the Council of Ministers. This solution broke with the country's tradition in producing constitutional texts, which had previously involved convening Constitutions Assembly, with only one prior exception being the Constitutional Charter of 1826. The drafters of the Constitution were jurists, including Salazar, Prime Minister, first as Minister of Finance and then as Prime Minister. In this process, they consulted personalities who, while not representing the interests of political and ideological platform underpinning the government, possessed knowledge of organized interests. The involvement of the National Political Council, with providing an opinion on the constitutional proposal, allowed input from figures associated with nationalism and republicanism. The Council of Ministers and the President of the Republic himself also consulted during the preparation of the Constitution, diversify these profiles, demonstrating openness to liberal principles. After a brief public consultation, the drafters of the constitutions returned to a cabinet-style process until the moment of the Constitution plebiscite, with this isolation allowing only scant information about the Constitution drafting process and employing censorship mechanisms to restrict public debate. The drafters of Constitution limited the impact of its decisions, amplified the perception of consensus regarding what was inscribed in the constitutional text, and reduced the possibility of interference that could have been initially by the liberal Republican military faction. After this long and peculiar process of drafting and publicitary approval of the 1933 Constitution, one can observe in this test elements of both traditions and innovation in relations to the country's constitutional tradition. By one hand, the Constitution exhibition the following traits in common with the constitutional texts that preceded: the affirmation of sovereignty character of the Portuguese state, the status of a unitary state, the enshrinement of fundamental human rights, the proclamation of the principle of legal equality, representative institutions, individual suffrage in the election of deputies, the plurality of sovereignty organs, always including a head of state or equivalent, a parliament and courts, the guarantees of the existence of municipalities and other local authorities, and the provision of various means of safeguard the Constitution against unconstitutional acts of powers. On the other hand, regarding the model of organization of state powers with respect to the strengthening of organs forming by the executive power, the Constitution reflected the Weimar experience. The widespread anti-parliamentarism of the time facilitated the inclusion of an increase in executive power in the constitutional text. Formally, this was achieved through the election of the President of the Republic by universal suffrage. The innovation law is ensuring this method in the constitutional text, similar to what had been done in Weimar. The strengthening of presidential legitimacy was also supported by the expansion of rights to vote, which, once established, reduced the scope of the same rights enshrined in the 1911 Republican Constitution. Also, is remained legally and administratively limited. The issue of presidential accountability was addressed by the Constitution, which stipulated that the President was not answerable to the National Assembly, the chamber of political representation, reinforced his position over the other political organs. However, other mechanisms led to a centralization of power in the figure of the President of the Council of Ministers, rather than a head of a state. Indeed, the main strengthening of the executive power occurred through another innovation inspired by the principles of the 1919 German Constitution, as argued in 1930s and 1940s, by ensuring the granting for special powers to the President of Council. Direct suffrage was retained, but it was now based on new foundations, distinct from purely liberal ones. Since the legislator was familiar with the German theories of Greek, Laban, and Jelinek, but especially aligned with the theses of Leon Deguy, it was possible to assume that with the enshrinement of suffrage, the intention was not to exaggerate the role of the election, seen merely as an empirical procedure for designating the representatives of the people. This position helps explain the distortion of electoral acts carried out in practice by the dictatorship, creating non-competitive elections with the suffrage serving merely to confer on the elected official an investiture in the name of national sovereignty. However, the main innovation in the new constitution was the extent to which economic life was addressed, a subject that was until the moment regulated in detail by ordinary legislation. The main idea was the purpose of state intervention in the economy to state foundations that would enable the achievement of social justice, particularly improving conditions for the most unprotected of these most vulnerable to competition and economic expoliation. Although the Weimar constitutional experience legitimized an extensive treatment of economy and social matters in the 1933 Constitution, the solutions enshrined in the two here entirely distinct. For example, in Portugal, economics bodies and corporative chamber could intervene in the legislative function. The corporative chamber had only an advisor role and, as such, was not binding on the decisions of the executive or the National Assembly. The logic of checks and balance between powers had no application to the organization of economic life.
So, yeah, I will talk about the Brazilian case. Okay, I will just explain three short topics about Brazil, about the constitutionalism in Brazil. That is much more simple than the Portuguese case. In Brazil, the constitution was a decree of the president. That's it. So the 3 points is that the first, in relation to the origin of the constitution itself, the justification of the regime to decree this constitution. The second, in relation to the origin of the power of the president of the republic. And the third one, the last one, in relation to the separation or in relation to the independence of the constitutional powers. The legislator made this difference, and the jurists also reinforce this difference. So, in relation to the first point, in the beginning of the Constitution, was necessary to justify because the previous Constitution was revoked and this new Constitution was decreed by the President. And the justification is because this new document is a response to the legitimate aspirations of the Brazilian people and the state of apprehension created in the country by the communist infiltration. And therefore, it can be said that this document played an important role in the institutionalization and political legitimation of the Estado Novo, the new state, throughout its duration. The Constitution itself, in the transitional and final provisions, decree a state of emergency throughout the country. And this is very interesting because this constitution, the contrary of the previous documents, not just authorizing the president to do this exceptional state, exceptional condition. The constitution itself decreed this exceptional state. And the president could revoke this situation if he perceived that the situation is better and the communist threat is not more so hard. Oh. Sorry. The second point is in relation to the origin of the power of the president. The prerogatives of the President of the Republic. According this perception, Pontes de Miranda, he was an important jurist in those periods, said that the powers of the president is originated by the president itself, not by the constitution. The president already was the president before the new constitution. The new constitution is derived by the power of the president, not the contrary, not the opposite. So the president is above the constitution. He is the origin of its own power. The constitution is derived of the president power, not the opposite. So this is an important situation, and this is clear in the Brazilian case. Completely different than in Portuguese, at least in the objectives of Salazar. And the third point is in relation to the division, the separation, and the independence of the powers. And there was an important discussion between or among jurists in those times in relation to this situation. All of them was according that there were different powers in Brazil. There were a separation of the powers, but not exactly the independence among them. In this case, in this relation, they talk and they justify the concentration of the power, not in relation to the independence of each power in relation to others. So, to conclude, the constitutions of the authoritarian regimes analyzed in this presentation refer to a context of global crisis, the interwar period, and of a national crisis in Portugal and Brazil, in which, nonetheless, they define a new purpose for their respective states and open new states in public law in each country. Although Portugal preceded Brazil with the 1933 constitution, the experience of Vargas quickly followed, but the Portuguese case was not reference to the constitutionalism in Brazil. In this sense, although this debate has not been explored in depth, it can be said that both countries were receptive to legal and doctrinal ideas related to the new social state, which facilitated the replacement of a previous constitutional order with a new one. Furthermore, concerned with the suitability of their new constitutions to the national realities of Portugal and Brazil, the two countries also converged in rejecting experiences such as those of the Soviet Union or fascist Italy, considering them inadequate, unfeasible, or simply excessive, although without allowing for extensive speculation on the matter. Although they did not abandon the constitutional model, always maintaining concern for legitimizing the respective constitutions, the Portuguese Constitution of 1933 and the Brazilian Constitution of 1937, suspended or suppressed in this adaptation parts that fulfilled the main functions of constitutionalism. These constitutional texts treat law from an instrumental perspective rather than respecting its autonomy, even when they incorporated provisions capable of limiting power. Such norms were subverted by the lack of consensus, as well as by arbitrariness and administrative interventions. Finally, it should be noted that these constitutional texts represented a break with the social model of liberalism, opening up to social content that lacked normative force and served primarily pragmatic political purpose, aligned with process of statization, reducing the boundary between the public and private spheres, and, once again, compressing the limits of constitutionalism. Nonetheless, their importance lay in facilitating the transition from the liberal state to the welfare state, which would only be fully established in the post-World War second democracies. Sorry. Thank you.